Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and on this last episode of the History of Cottingham Snickets, we're going to be taking a look at a snicket that's not really a snicket, but it is the northern end of what used to be the most important route in and out of Cottingham for hundreds of years. Snuff Mill Lane. So you'd think that the most logical place to start the story of Snuff Mill Lane would be on Snuff Mill Lane, but actually, for reasons which I hope will become apparent later on, the best place to start it is to talk about Milbeck, which is a stream that originates in the fields to the north of Cottingham, where the springs give rise to a number of small becks, such as Crakebeck as well. And this stream runs southwards into Cottingham, and in the Middle Ages onwards it ran through a mill called North Mill, which stood where basically Milbeck Lane now stands, and it flowed south underneath Northgate and all the way down through what's now Canongate, where it's now culverted and underground, where it comes out of its culvert today here just beyond that fence and round the corner, and travels here alongside Bogside Walk, the part of the snicket that we covered in the first of these episodes. And from here it carries on a little bit further and then kinks to the south at its junction with Crakebeck. A little bit further on than that is where it disappears today, again into a culvert. But Milbeck didn't always disappear into a culvert. This used to just be a bridge. In fact, you can hear the culvert now. You can hear the roaring torrent if you ever cross the road of Beck Bank here near that manhole cover. Instead, it used to actually run along the side of the aptly named Beck Bank, which obviously was named because of the beck. And these houses, or some of these houses certainly, would have actually had, rather than these front gardens, a small bridge to access them, rather like what we see down Eppleworth Road and Harland Way today. And further up there you can see the Green Verge, which is exactly where the beck used to run before it was buried. And a bit further along it crosses underneath the road of Newgate Street, where it meets Thwaite Street, and that is where our journey proper begins. So we know that this lane is very old because it followed the waterway, the beck, and generally speaking a lot of the oldest paths followed the course of waterways. This is no exception. Snuff Mill Lane is certainly medieval in origin at the very least, possibly even earlier still. And you can see where it used to run here. This grass verge to my side basically is where the beck used to be before it was culverted. And it ran down here towards an old medieval corn mill known as South Mill, to differentiate it from the other mill that we talked about, which was the North Mill. They were good at naming things in the past. That mill was repurposed in the 18th century by a man called William Travis to make snuff, a kind of ground tobacco product ground into a fine powder and mixed with other things that people could carry around in a little box and then snuff up their nose rather than smoking. And it was very popular in the Georgian and Victorian heyday. So popular, in fact, that William Travis made a fortune from it and built the rather imposing Snuff Mill house that now dominates this end of the only tarmacked bit of Snuff Mill Lane. The mill was actually attached to the house. And what I find absolutely brilliant about this mill is that the beck here, in order to drive the mill, was dammed by sluice gates. So all of this that you see here, all this greenery and beyond, would actually have been a kind of an artificial lake, a very small, very long artificial lake, a very shallow one. But you couldn't drive a water wheel with a trickle like we saw down the side of Bogside Walk. It had to be dammed and allowed to build up until you had a good force and a good weight of water behind it, and then you would open the sluice gates and that water would just force through and drive the water wheel, hence driving your mill, and you'd be able to do that in kind of bursts until this had basically emptied itself out, at which point you shut the sluice gates and it all builds back up again. Fascinating stuff. Now on the other side of the road we also have these lovely North Eastern Railways 1930s cottages. Now, I say North Eastern Railway. The North Eastern Railway had a kind of charitable fund set up so that it could build housing for retired railway workers. And these cottages are the products of that fund, like several others around Cottingham as well. And it's ironic really, because the North Eastern Railway Fund actually outlived the North Eastern Railway itself. These cottages were built in 1936, which is a good 13 years after the North Eastern Railway was absorbed into the London North Eastern Railway during the Great Grouping. And they still proudly carry that little plaque with the North Eastern Railway on it to this day. So, as we mentioned, William Travis must have been making a pretty penny from the snuff business, because in 1790 he decided that the grandeur of Snuff Mill House wasn't enough to suit his grand aspirations, and he bought all of the land behind me where this housing estate is. All of that was the grounds of what was to be one of Cottingham's biggest and grandest houses, Cottingham Hall. It occupied all of this ground. It had a huge fish pond that was actually fed from the mill beck itself. It was quite magnificent. But sadly, it hasn't lasted, and it was one of the early victims of the growing expansion of Hull as a suburb and the decreasing significance of its great houses. It was demolished in 1935 to make way for many of these houses that you see behind me. In fact, the only thing that's left of William Travis's entire catalogue of property is just Snuff Mill House. The mill itself, again, was demolished in the 1930s, leaving just the house standing. Now this section of the route actually does turn in to an actual snicket. It is just a path. You can see there Snuff Mill House in the background, and it's sliced across by two roads, which is actually just one looped road, Hornbeam Drive, that cuts right across and slices Snuff Mill Lane into three segments. And all of this is because of the huge and growing importance of Cottingham as one of Hull's major suburbs, and also its growing importance as a place for people from Hull to retire to. All these very small bungalow type dwellings that were put here in the 50s and 60s are a testament to a growing aged population of the village. Lots of people who wanted to retire here, quite rightly so, because it's a lovely quiet place, moved into places like this. Now, this particular stretch of Snuff Mill Lane I really love, because this gives you some idea of what this lane might have looked like in the distant past. And I aren't talking about just a couple of hundred years ago. I'm talking about hundreds of years ago. I'm talking about this might have been what it looked like in the Middle Ages, with trees and bushes on either side and mud churned up by numerous and plentiful horses and wagons. This is a real trip into history, is this one. I love it. And here, standing here, we also see this, which shoots off that way towards Wood Lane Farm, which is the building that you can see at the end there. Now, before Priory Road was developed, this was the main way that you would get from Wood Lane to either Cottingham or Hull. You would come down here and join Snuff Mill Lane, go that way to Cottingham, or that way if you wanted to go in Hull. But these days, of course, Priory Road was developed, and not that long ago either, and it cut straight across this, reducing this to nothing more than a cut through between Priory Road and this. And as we get here to the end of this stretch, we find the place where historically Snuff Mill Lane was first sliced in two. In the 1840s, George Hudson, the railway king, and the Hull and Selby Railway built a railway line here to connect Hull with Bridlington. And it did. And it sliced right across Cottingham, cutting across Snuff Mill Lane, Thwaite Street, and the junction between In Common Lane, later New Village Road, and, of course, Northgate. And it miraculously survived the 1960s beaching cuts, and is still, even now, today, a vibrant connection between Cottingham and Hull. As you can see. It's also a quick and easy way to get to the seaside if you fancy a day by the sea. Now, this final stretch of Snuff Mill Lane after the railway crossing is largely maintained the way that it is because it's an access road to the cottage that's here. And it's a cottage that's built around cottages that have been here for at least a couple of 100 years. They've been integrated into the extended building quite beautifully. You can't really see it from here apart from the chimneys, but if you see it from the railway line, you'll see what I mean. But my favourite bit of this cottage is its shed. This shed, which is an old railway wagon, which is a really lovely nod to the fact that the line is literally just over the other side of the fish pond. Now, also, before the culvert, the beck used to run alongside this side of Snuff Mill Lane all the way up here, and it's joined on the other side by another beck that isn't culverted, a small drain that comes off the fields next to the railway line. And they run all the way along the side, just as Milbeck would have done, all the way to the end where it meets Bricknell Avenue. So something that confused and puzzled me as a teenager, at the southern end of Snuff Mill Lane, where it meets Bricknell Avenue, spanning off to the west is an embankment, which you can see behind me here. Now, I used to come here on sunny summer days with a packed lunch, walk along the embankment, pick my way through the brambles and sit at the end in the sunshine watching the trains go past. I may have train spotted as a teenager, but it was just nice. It's nice. But what really puzzled me is there's no corresponding embankment on the other side of the railway line. You see, I assumed that this was probably leading up to a bridge, but a bridge would have required there to be an embankment on the other side, and I didn't know whether or not the embankment had maybe been taken away and bulldozed on the other side, but not on this side. But it turns out, with a bit of investigation, that actually it was never built. This embankment was built on the bricks and rubble from bombed houses from World War II. And the original plan, it would appear, was to build a southern Cottingham bypass road that would have gone over the railway lines and headed westwards to link up with the main north-south route that would link Beverley to the Humber. But that never happened, leaving just this little embankment that stops right next to the railway line. And I would have gone up there myself now to show you what it was like, but it's massively overgrown these days, and I think without donning a pair of wellies and wielding a machete, there's not much chance of me getting to the end. But still, there it is. So I mentioned earlier that this was an old path, and I was going to explain to you why the beck was so important. You see, let me tell you a story. That first episode I did about Boardside Walk, I postulated a theory that the path was actually the beginning of a much longer route that went along Embankment Lane all the way to the banks of the River Hull. And it turns out I was not 100% wrong. The chairman of the Cottingham Local History Society reached out and told me that apparently that route was in fact to Hull Bank, because Cottingham as a parish used to be enormous, like actually gigantic. It stretched all the way to the River Hull at the east and all the way down to Newland in the southeast with its border with Hull. And both of those areas were basically part of Cottingham's parish, even though they were separate hamlets of their own. And the road along Embankment Lane didn't go to the ferry crossing at Stone Ferry. It actually went to the hamlet of Hull Bank. And likewise, this Snuff Mill Lane is just the northern part of a huge long road that ran alongside Milbeck all the way to Newland. And that did go beyond all the way to Stone Ferry as well, because that was all part of the parish. And the parishioners at these hamlets would have needed these connective roads in order to get to the centre of the parish, Cottingham, for things like baptisms and funerals and weddings and other parish-related business, not to mention, of course, the markets. So these roads would have been really important, and they would have been really important for a very, very, very long time. This, Snuff Mill Lane, was the main route from Cottingham to the town of Hull via the hamlet of Newland. That's how important it was. Now Milbeck, which runs alongside this, carries on along Hull Road and Cottingham Road, which is of course the bulk of that route today. Culverted these days still, but in the old days it used to be known as the Cottingham and Newland Drain, and that's a story and a route that I'll be following in another episode in the future. But the most telling piece of evidence that Snuff Mill Lane was the most important route comes when you look at this part of it, where it joins what's now Britnell Avenue, which is actually a very, very young road by comparison to what we're around. Snuff Mill Lane heads in a straight line that carries on the maps almost straight down Hull Road and Cottingham Road. And this part that heads directly off north sticks out at an angle. It's clearly the diversion. But what caused it to die? I mean, what caused this to become the main route instead of this? Well, the reasons are many and varied. The railway undoubtedly played a part in that demise in a couple of different ways. One, it sliced across Snuff Mill Lane and turned it into a constantly stopping flow of traffic rather than an easily flowing one like Hull Road here, which doesn't have a crossing. It just kind of heads off north, takes in New Village Road and swings wide and doesn't come across the railway crossing until much later in its length, after which it's already linked up to Inglemeyer, Endyke and the eastern end of Thwaite Street. Whereas this, if you were to head down here, yes, it would take you slightly closer to Cottingham Centre, but it would mean you'd probably have to stop because the trains in the late 19th and early 20th century were considerably busier than they are today. And they're not busy now, as anyone who's getting stuck at the traffic lights in Cottingham will tell you. But the other reason as well is to do with the railway, is that it shifted the focus of Cottingham. it turned it into a commuter centre. And that commuter centre had housing that developed around the railway station, and it developed the area of New Village Road, it developed the area of Thwaite Street, it developed the area of Hull Road, which then spread down here. So when it came to road traffic becoming increasingly important, naturally the one that got the tarmac treatment was the big wide road with all the houses on it, and not the little country lane that had none. And that's partly why, or mostly why, this became the road that this used to be. But even today, it still stands, and it's still substantial compared to a lot of the Snickets that we have looked at. And it's still a really nice walk through the country, even on a cold, lockdown day. It's a good way to get some exercise.